Hello, I'm Diane Tillman. I'm one of the founders of Living Values Education and the author of the Living Values Education series of books. There's actually 15 values education resource books. Plus, I'm the author of a mindful parenting guide. I worked for 23 years as a school psychologist in Southern California, and have been working with Living Values Education as an educational psychologist for the last 20 years. I've had the honor of traveling the globe and working with people from many different countries. I'd like to thank Profesionales de Bienestar for inviting me to speak at your conference, Human Dignity and Values in Mexico City. My apologies for not being able to be with you, but I will be with you in spirit. And after you see this presentation, I'll be available to answer any questions you have, and I'd like to listen to your comments. But I'm very pleased that you've chosen this topic, because it's a topic that's really needed so very much in the world. There are so many people that don't have the feeling of dignity inside, and there are billions that are treated without dignity. As we all know, human beings need an unalienable right is that of human dignity. We all thrive when we're treated with love and respect and appreciation. And to be treated as less than, or to be taken advantage of ruins the joy and the delight in life, and creates people cascading downward, far from their potential. And so I would like to discuss this relationship between human dignity and values. And what I see is that values is the key to restore human dignity in people and in the world. And so I would like to tell you some stories. And I'll begin with a story, actually a couple of stories from Thailand. I had the honor of working with the Karen tribe there many years ago. I went into 2 camps with Rachel Flower, who was the Living Values Coordinator in Thailand at the time. She had communicated with me and said, "Diane, would you come to Thailand when you're on your next journey? The leader of the Karen tribe in charge of education in Chiang Mai wants us to teach living values to the educators that are in the camp. And they don't want to learn it, and I don't know what to do." And so I think we were 7 hours in a toot-toot, and we went up near Mae Sot, as I recall, and near the border of Myanmar, Burma, where these refugees were from. And we talked to the teachers, and they were so upset and so concerned about the atrocities. And they said, "We have no interest in learning about values. We just want your help to stop these atrocities." And we said, we don't have any power over that government. But we listened and we talked to them. And then later that night we went to see the head teacher. And I asked him, I said, "Why aren't they interested in learning about peace?" And he looked at me and he said, "Well, if we learn about peace, we'll all be killed." I thought, wow. So I told him some stories. I'd had the privilege of meeting James Jonah, I think, a year or 2 earlier. And he was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations at that time. And he told us about a preventative diplomacy initiative that he had done. And I was in contact through the UNA USA with another person, Steve Demoff, who was working on the creation of the International Criminal Court of Justice at the time. And so I said to the head teacher, I told him stories about their work. And I said, eventually, politics will take care of politics. But when you become free, when you are not in this camp anymore, will you have the skills? Will your community, will your tribe have the skills to not recreate the conditions for war? Will you be free of the ego and the anger and the greed that causes war? Will you have the communication skills that you need? And he looked at me and he said, I'll translate the materials. And so a year later, we started with 36 teachers. We spent 9 days in a training because they needed to heal from the trauma of war. And we had them reflect on their values, because one of the things about living values education that we know is that all people have this innate beauty of values and qualities inside. But they had lost touch with that. When we went into the camp the first time, what we saw was very depressed people. Depressed adults, hopeless adults, a lot of despair. The only toy we saw was one volleyball, and only young adults were playing with that. The children would actually stand and stare at us for hours and not move. We saw no play. We saw spontaneous hitting, but we saw no play. And so we worked with these 26 teachers. They were all from the Karen tribe, living in the refugee camp. And we spent 9 days, and I remember a scene where I took a war puppet on the third day, and I had them speak to the war puppet from the puppet that they were holding. What they said was so beautiful. And I went back a year later. Rachel went into the camp every 3 months, and I went back a year later. And we interviewed a lot of the teachers, 24 of them, about the effects. All but one had had 90 to 100% of their students buy into nonviolence and peace. One teacher, Pamuka, told me that her 16 to 20-year-olds used to be cruel. They would fight frequently, and they got angry and upset very, very quickly. She said now they are never cruel, and they never fight. And she told me some beautiful stories. But the teachers told me that instead of beating the children, they now held their hands. Pamuka told me that she didn't used to even hug her own grandchild, but now she allowed her to sit in her lap and even pull her hair, and she enjoyed her. After 2 years of them implementing the program, I was having a talk with Saw Peter, the leader of the camp. And I asked him, I said, Saw Peter, what changes have you seen in the camp? He said, I've seen 2 changes. He said, one change is that my 11 section leaders used to spend most of their time dealing with the fighting of the different gangs from each section. He said now they don't have to deal with any fighting for even 1 second because the children aren't fighting. The second thing he said really surprised me. He said, and we captured 3 Burmese people 3 months ago, and we decided not to kill them. He said, the time for killing is over. I really didn't know what to say. I just sort of looked at him flabbergasted and said, oh, that's very good, Saw Peter. But he asked me a question. He said, Diane, you know, there's some corruption in our camp among the different sections. And so could you stop the corruption, please? And I looked at him and I said, Salpeter, how do you expect me to do that? And he said, well, you will. He said, think of something. Can you do it on Saturday? And so I said, okay, so invite your section leaders. And Rachel and I went over. And we put it in the framework of a Living Values workshop. So we did one activity for children 3 to 7, which was just singing a peace song. We did another activity from the young adult books. And that activity was looking at the problems of the world. They chose war. We looked at what are the factors that contribute to war, the anti-values that contribute to that, and the values that would resolve that. And then we did the one on corruption. And the one on corruption is that there was a very large whiteboard. And so I drew a large circle, and I put honesty on one side and corruption on the other side. And then I did not give any input. I asked them for their answers. And I would write in English, and someone would write in Korean below what I wrote. So the first one, what are the effects when you're honest for yourself? What are the effects when you're dishonest? How do you feel inside? And we did that for the self and for family. And then we started to do it for business. And they started to talk about how when there's honesty in business, then there's prosperity. There's return because there's trust, because there's return customers. But when there's dishonesty or corruption and you don't do what you say, then you don't have the return customers and people don't trust you and the businesses will not do well. We talked about corruption in education versus education when there's honesty. And what they did is they painted a picture of when there's honesty, there is a society, as we spent 45 minutes doing this, and we looked at the education system, healthcare, the society, the community, and finally the world. And what they saw was that when there is this honesty and this trust and this integrity and this clarity and this lack of fear, that you're building a society of peace. And when somebody puts money in their pocket that is supposed to go for books or for a new school or for good nutrition, that children are marginalized. Children don't have opportunity to have their full education. They aren't able to grow towards their potential. When there's money put in the pockets instead of going into health care, there are people that are ill. There are people that are ill when they don't need to be. There aren't adequate medicines. There isn't the feeling of being taken, of being helped. That there's this growing disparity between the rich and the poor. And then there's anger, and because of that anger, there's needs that are not being met. So with underdevelopment and with poverty and increasing marginalization, there is violence. There is the feeling of not belonging. There is anger. And then one Korean man, he was, I had asked the question of, what happens in the community and what happens when there's corruption. And he looked at me and he said that one of the things that happens when there's corruption is there is unequal distribution of resources. And when he said that, the eyes of all the section leaders got very big. And Peter looked at me and he hit his hand and he's going, like, You did it, you did it. It was so interesting. There was very little to be corrupt about in the camp. They had bamboo houses and leaf roofs, roofs made out of leaves. And they only had to eat white rice, fish paste, and they got some oil and salt and charcoal, and that was it. But I would sometimes see bags of rice go out of the camp. And so there was very little to be corrupt about, but it was happening. What I saw in the camp is that becoming aware of their values, being able to experience love and peace again, being able to communicate in a positive way, being able to set limits, being able to do conflict resolution, being able to be willing to be loving and kind to each other and to cooperate and be honest, that these were things that restored the spirit of dignity in people. Their own peace and their own love and their own ability to give created that spirit of dignity within themselves. But as they began to drop the violence and to increase their respect, and they treated each other with respect, then they were being treated in a whole new way. The children who we hadn't even asked to help with conflict resolution with the other children, they would come up to children who weren't in the Living Values program and say, "You don't need to fight. Would you like us to help?" And they would spontaneously do conflict resolution with them. So it was a lovely thing to watch how they regained their own dignity through values and how they treated each other, and how the sense of hope and pride and peace and love and caring and good things were happening in that refugee camp, in that community. But there is another level of human dignity, and there are more areas that values affect. And we see that. So while I as a person can have peace and love and human dignity and spread that with my community, a lot of people don't look at values in the wider context. And in the wider context, it would mean that, am I going to extend that care only to my friends and only to my circle? Or am I going to extend it to everyone? Really, how can I, as a person, have dignity if I am cheating others, if I am taking advantage of others? And how are other people feeling when there's so much corruption or so much injustice or mistreatment that they are not accorded that? Sometimes people are corrupt for very innocent reasons. They are corrupt because they want their family to be okay, because they want to be safe, so that they think, if I take a little bit of money from here, if I take a little bit of money from there. But what they're doing is they're oppressing others. And so there's all kinds of consequences that happen that they're not aware of. One incredibly powerful example of that right now is in Nigeria. Nigeria is one of the wealthiest countries in Africa. But as the wealth of the country has increased in terms of gross national product, the poverty level has simultaneously increased. The poverty is 50-some% in the South. But in some of the northern states where Boko Haram is prevalent, the subsistence poverty level is as high as 86%. That means there is barely enough food, water, shelter, and clothing to survive. And what we see in that state is that there's almost no education for the populace. And so there's incredible poverty, underdevelopment, but there's ignorance. And so if a soldier comes to you and offers you a rifle and says, you know, if you do this, I will take care of you and I will provide for your family, do you believe them? If you are uneducated, you might. And so there's this incredible need to educate the minds of people, but also to educate hearts. But when we educate hearts, we must educate for all. All people deserve human dignity. All people deserve to be treated with values. I mentioned Nigeria because I wanted to tell you a story about this corruption and the effects of corruption, because people often don't realize how it can affect the whole society. So I was in Lagos and I did a Living Values Education seminar for educators. It was at a posh hotel. We had lovely coffee breaks. The participants were wonderful educators and they were dressed in their satin robes and they looked very royal and very colorful, and it was wonderful. But when I went to where I was staying each night, I passed by incredible hovels. There was a lot of poverty. There was just a lot of poverty, a lot of underdevelopment. And when we entered the middle class area where I was staying, there was a barrier, and there was 2 guards on each end of the street where I was staying. There was barriers with 2 guards, so people could not come into that area. And in front of the house where I was staying, there was a very tall metal fence, and there was a guardhouse and a guard 24/7. The first day I was there, I said, okay, I'm going to go for a walk. I'll see you later. And they said, well, you can't go for a walk. And I said, why not? And they said, well, it's not safe. So I was asked if I would walk around the house. And so that's how I had my walk every day, walking around the house. But towards the end of my time in Lagos, I noticed that there was a couple of people having long discussions, and there was a lot of disagreement, which I wasn't accustomed to. And I finally said to them, because they were speaking in a language that I didn't know, I said, why are you arguing every morning? What are you arguing about? And they said, well, we want to take you somewhere for a picnic your last day here, and so we were just trying to decide where to take you for a picnic. And I said, well, why is that a problem? And they looked at me and they said, well, we want you to be safe. My skin is white. That was a problem. There was other people in the group that were Asian. There was a couple of what they called us Europeans. So there was 2 of us Europeans, there was some Asians, and there was a lot of Africans. And so they finally decided that we would go together to an island. So they actually hired a boat to take me on a picnic. That is how unsafe it was in that society. And so people that are corrupt, they do it innocently to help their family, but they don't realize the impact on the entire society. There are actually people in this world that are so rich that under their huge yachts, they have submarines, a submarine circling nearby, so that if they are attacked by pirates, they can go into their safe room and go into the submarine and be safe. But are we asking, why are there pirates? Why is there such need? I think we need to take another look at the effects of greed. We have a beautiful planet, an incredibly beautiful planet. And what we see is the lack of values is harming our planet. And hence, there is less and less human dignity for people and for our planet. In that lack of respect for the environment has caused global warming, global climate change, with some quite disastrous effects. In terms of the economic recessions and meltdowns, it's the anti-value of greed. And so when something is built, or when something is going to function well, then it needs all components. So if we were to build a telescope because you want to see the stars, the telescope's not going to work if you forget to put in the lens. If you're reassembling your cell phone because it's not worked, so you turn it off, you open up at the back, but you forget to put in the battery, it's not going to work. And so our planet and the human beings on it, we've forgotten a critical component, and that component is values. As human beings, we all deserve to live in a state of dignity, and we all deserve to be treated that way. It is right to extend human rights to everyone. I believe that the nature of human beings is good. I believe that if we provide the conditions of well-being, if we provide proactive care, if we help people learn the skills of peace, of respect, of honesty, of love, of acceptance, of tolerance, that we can create this beautiful planet in a new way. It can be a beautiful planet in which everyone flourishes. And so, I hope you'll join me. It's a very simple process, really. I'd like you all to pause just for a moment, and I want to ask you, if you could pick two values, what values would most change, most help you, and most help the world? Your answer might be peace and respect. Your answer might be compassion and love. Your answer might be integrity and freedom. Whatever your answer is, you are right. And so I would like to ask you to be willing to think about this topic and to bring perhaps one value into your life. When we have a value, what it means, yes, it's a guiding principle. Yes, it's a compass through which we can guide our life. But a value is more than just an occasional virtue. A value means that we treat everyone with that all the time. And so I'd like to invite you to join the Living Values Education family and the many different wonderful organizations around the world, including the organization that you have, Profesionales de Bienestar. I'd like to invite us all to take one or two values into our lives and live that. Thank you very much.